Now, much of what we have learned about the Gaonic period actually comes from the Cairo Geniza. So a Geniza literally is kind of a hidden place, and it's a place where Jews for many, many centuries now had the habit of kind of putting in degraded sacred texts that they couldn't use anymore. So they would put these texts into the Geniza. For example, you do that with a prayer book that's falling apart or a photocopy of a Talmudic text that we no longer want. And instead of simply throwing it in the trash with all the other trash, the custom is to put it into one of these Geniza. And when the Geniza fills up, you take it out and it's often buried in a Jewish burial ground as a sign of respect to these texts. In Cairo, they began throwing stuff into their Geniza in the attic, probably back in the 11th century or maybe even earlier. But the problem is that it was a big attic, and nobody actually shoveled the stuff out to bury it. So for hundreds of years, people were tossing stuff into this attic. Now ends up being a treasure trove of all kinds of different documents, because people ended up not just throwing sacred texts in, but any text ultimately that they thought was written in Hebrew, that they thought may be related to a sacred text, that they didn't want to separate from the sacred text because they were lazy, they would throw it all up there. In the late 19th or early 20th centuries, you started to have collectors who would kind of come up here. Now remember, Cairo's dry. So it's like the Dead Sea Scrolls. All this stuff would have disappeared if it was, for example, in Northern Europe. It would have degraded because of the moisture. But like the Dead Sea Scrolls, this stuff survives. Much of it had never been copied. It's not part of any kind of living tradition, so it would have been lost. And one of the things that comes out of the Geniza is this letter by this man named Periphery ben Baboy, which is a great name. But Periphery ben Baboy, right, beginning probably in the early 9th century, about 810, 812, sends an open letter, called an open letter, a circular, to Jews, especially in North Africa, but it could have been, a kind of a much wider expanse. And this is a passage. I'd like to read one passage by Periphery ben Baboy. Even in the days of the Messiah, they, the Babylonian academies, will not experience the travail of the Messiah. For it is written, O Zion, escape, you who dwell in Babylonia. And Zion is nothing but the academy, which is distinguished in Torah and precepts. As it is written, writhe and cry out, daughter of Zion, like a woman in childbirth. But now you will depart the city and dwell in the field and go to Babylonia. There you will be saved, and thence will God redeem you from the hand of your enemies. And redemption will come first to the academy of Babylonia, for as Israel is redeemed by their academy's virtue, redemption comes first to them. To understand the passage, you have to think about the larger context of the letter. In this letter, Periphery ben Baboy is basically arguing that the Torah that comes out of the land of Israel, we might call the Palestinian rabbinic academies or the Palestinian Jewish communities. I'll use those terms interchangeably, even though I realize that they can be politically loaded today, but that was with the ancient terms. But that those customs and texts, that Torah that's coming out of out of Israel, is wrong. So instead, what people need to do is to pay attention to the Babylonians, because that's where Torah is coming from. It's the academies of Babylonia. That's what this passage is arguing. But the passage goes even further than that. It's not just that there are these two competing centers and one is better than the other. In fact, Periphery ben Baboy in that passage argues that Babylonia is Zion. Every time we read Zion, we need to read Babylonia. Babylonia is the center. It's not simply a practical matter. It's almost a theological matter. Babylonia is the new Zion, the place of redemption. So when we normally think of redemption and kind of redemptive theologies, Jewish redemptive theologies, we think about Israel, or the land of Israel at the center, the promised land, the land where all redemption will occur. But to go back to that passage, Periphery ben Baboy says no. It's the Babylonian academies. That's where redemption is going to come first. So we have this kind of idea of of the relationship between diaspora and periphery that for Periphery ben Baboy is almost reversed, right? The diaspora is Israel. The center is Babylonia. Periphery ben Baboy gets his authority, or he makes a claim to authority, that can only be made from a place of power. So to the extent that the Geonim feel that they're in the center of power, right, he becomes a representative and a projection of that power. Now, it's always interesting to differentiate and to know that a claim to power is not necessarily actual power. And you can send that letter and be completely ignored. It's unclear how that letter was received. And one can imagine certain different communities in Northern Africa reading this letter and saying, no, that's totally hubris. It's not something we want to do. It's not our tradition, and we're going to toss it in the trash can. In fact, maybe that's exactly what they did in Cairo, because we found it in their trash can, right, in the Geniza. So it would be hard to imagine a letter like that coming out of a group of people or a movement that didn't feel, at least, that it had some kind of authoritative legs to stand on. Now, this actually resonates in all kinds of interesting ways, I think, with modern relationships between Israel and the diaspora. Because what normally we're used to thinking about the diaspora relationship between Jews in the diaspora and Israel is a relationship of periphery and center. It's an understanding that's being questioned today. Right? It's an understanding that for a few decades now, you see, especially in the United States, a sense that maybe the center of Judaism isn't Israel. Maybe there can be two centers of Judaism, or more than two centers of Judaism. So it is fairly clear that the rabbinic establishment in the state of Israel today is making a claim that they are the center of Jewish life. And that they're making that against what actually is at least an almost as large and certainly richer Jewish community in the United States. Are they really the center, or are they not the center? Do they really have the authority to make that claim, or don't they? And I think that's an interesting parallel to make back in the Geonic period as well.